Ukraine deserves better.
Will regular American people live better if Russia is defeated?
What it invites is nuclear war.
What would you tell to a regular Ukrainian person who is watching this interview?
A president of Ukraine should protect the people of Ukraine. That means not sending them to the front die in huge numbers.
The foreign policy of the United States is out of touch with reality. We can't trust it.
The United States is not a friend of Ukraine. It created a huge mess for Ukraine.
How do you think people in Ukraine and in Russia and in the world could get hopes for better lives?
Peace is real and possible. No matter what happens, there will be Ukraine and there will be Russia.
Dear friends, hello, welcome. It is a pleasure for me to introduce a very honorable guest we have today, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, one of the most renowned economists in the world, professor at Columbia University, PhD of philosophy at Harvard University, a special advisory for several UN Secretary Generals, and the owner of more than 40 honorary degrees in various universities of the world, and the person who has dedicated his life to combating poverty all around the world. Professor Sachs, hello, it's an honor to have you.
It's a great pleasure for me to be with you and an honor. Thank you.
Professor Sachs, it is always for me a great interest to follow everything you do, but after your latest speech that you delivered at the European Parliament, a lot of people in Russia and Ukraine have been asking me to do this interview with you. Thank you so much for agreeing. Your great talent is to explain economy very simply so that it is even clearer to a child. You are an author of the ideas that have rescued many countries from poverty. You are the creator of Economic Miracle for Poland. And today I'd like to talk to you. How do you think people in Ukraine and in Russia and in the world could get hopes for better lives? Today in Ukraine and everywhere in the world, everyone is talking about the potential rare earth minerals deal between Ukraine and the United States. How do you think, what would this deal mean for a regular Ukrainian person? How it would change their lives?
Not very much. That's not the way to economic well-being. The way to economic well-being is peace and normal economy based on a diversified economy, skills, trade, and though it may seem unthinkable, normal economic relations for Ukraine with Russia, normal economic relations for Ukraine with Europe in a peaceful world. That's the way to prosperity.
Well, many people in Ukraine are really worried that Ukraine could become a colony if Zelensky is to ratify this deal with the United States.
Well, I think those are legitimate fears. The United States wants to grab resources of Ukraine. Clearly, the U.S. government doesn't think much about Ukraine. It thinks much about the minerals. And so it's a very strange thing to be negotiating such an agreement right now. The main issue for Ukraine overwhelmingly is peace and security, not minerals deals, not minerals deals that are being imposed or squeezed on the country. But at the same time, Ukraine needs an active diplomacy for peace, not just for war. This is a very basic and important point that I've been trying to make to Ukrainian counterparts for many, many years. The entire approach of the Ukrainian government of believing the United States or Britain that somehow Ukraine's going to be saved by the so-called Western powers or by NATO was a very naive idea. I said that, I explained that, I described why that was the case in detail. Unfortunately, I was proved right in this. Ukraine needs direct diplomacy with Russia to settle this war, and not on some fantasy terms, but on pragmatic and realistic terms that bring the war to an end.
Professor Sachs, I wanted to ask you a question that I've been thinking about all my life. I'm same age as modern Ukraine, and everything I've been witnessing from one year to another is unfortunately a stagnation of the Ukrainian economy. You know Russia well. You've been advisor to Yeltsin, you've been advisor to President Kuchma. You're also saying you've been meeting Vladimir Zelensky. How do you think how it has come to a situation where Ukraine, from potentially a successful country that used to be one of the most economically advanced in the Soviet times, country with 50 million of population and plenty of resources, has become an extremely poor country? Before the war, more than 60% of Ukrainian people were living below the poverty line. How do you think, who is to blame that Ukrainian was heading towards stagnation? What went so wrong?
Well, I think definitely for the last 11 years since the Maidan coup and the events that followed that, which was the breakout of war, essentially, Ukraine has been in a war environment. The war didn't start in February 2022. The war started in February 2014. And it's tragic, but countries cannot achieve economic well-being during war. That's impossible. Countries need peace. Unfortunately, the peace that was available, the Minsk agreements, for example, were never implemented. And I believe, although it's not very fashionable to say, especially among Ukrainian leaders, I believe the United States ruined Ukraine because the United States told Ukraine, don't be neutral, don't have relations with Russia, take our side, we'll save you. We'll save you militarily, we'll defeat Russia. Many fantastical ideas. In other words, I don't mean great ideas, I mean fantasy ideas. And unfortunately, Ukrainian leaders naively bought into this kind of fantasy. You know, as a young country, Ukraine has lots of hopes, but those hopes are sometimes not so realistic. And if you try to explain realism to people with high hopes, they think you're an enemy sometimes. They say, why are you saying these negative things? We believe all the magic we're being told by the United States. But I know the United States well. I explained the U.S. magic isn't so magical. But my friends or former friends in Ukraine didn't want to listen to this.
Well, you're absolutely right, Professor Sachs. Any Ukrainian is absolutely convinced that the United States is some kind of heaven on earth, and the government of the United States always wanted Ukraine to be a prosperous country. It is indeed what regular Ukrainians were made to believe. And also, people in my country are convinced that the United States are so perfect and there is zero corruption in the United States. They have created a huge system of body-spine corruption, and Ukraine has done the same. But what is the true United States? Is there corruption in the USA?
First of all, I'm sorry, really sorry to tell the truth to everybody, but the United States never cared about Ukraine. The United States cared about defeating Russia, which is quite a different thing. The United States viewed Ukraine as a way to weaken Russia. The idea was that NATO, the U.S. military alliance, would expand eastward, not only to Ukraine, but also to Georgia. And the idea was very clear. By this expansion of NATO, Russia would be surrounded in the Black Sea. So there would be Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, all surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. It's an idea essentially that goes back 175 years because Britain and France once went to war with Russia, the so-called Crimean War, on the same idea. Britain wanted to push Russia out of the Black Sea region. And we're in the second Crimean War now. But it means that Ukraine was being used. It was being used to weaken Russia. Americans don't know anything about Ukraine, don't care anything about Ukraine. This was a foreign policy game by the United States. It's a very tragic one, but it was essentially a game to weaken Russia. So this is where so much went wrong. Had Ukraine remained neutral, had the United States not joined other forces to overthrow Yanukovych in February 2014, had the West not pushed so hard to say, you're on our side and you're against Russia, but rather to say Ukraine geographically lies between the European Union and Russia and therefore can prosper by engaging in trade in both directions and also being an effective bridge between Russia and Europe. These were the right ideas economically. These are the ideas that I believed in and worked on in the 1990s. What went wrong is the United States took a different view. We won, Russia lost. Now we will go on to defeat Russia entirely. Well, you get into a lot of trouble with that approach. And Ukraine, unfortunately, became the battleground of the US approach vis-a-vis Russia. And now, unfortunately, and I know many people will resist what I'm saying, but the fact is that all the Russophobia, all the Russia hatred, doesn't solve any problem, doesn't make Ukraine secure. It can't make Ukraine secure. No matter what happens, there will be Ukraine and there will be Russia, and they will be next to each other. And the first rule of economics is have normal relations with your neighbors. Don't let a country several thousand miles away, like the United States, say, oh, you're on our side and your other neighbor is an enemy. That can never work. This is the fallacy of the whole US approach. From thousands of miles away, the United States tried to manipulate the scene. When I explained this to Ukrainian friends many years ago, they hated to hear it. They said, oh, you're just repeating Putin's propaganda. I said, no. I have been a friend of Ukraine from the first days. I advised the Ukrainian government in the earliest days of independence. I've been a friend of all of the countries of the region. I don't pick and choose. I'm a nice guy. I'm not on one side versus another side. But unfortunately, the optimism was so high in the post-Maidan governments that the United States was like a magical force in the minds of people. Oh, as long as the US is on our side, we can do anything. We can hate Russia. We can go to war with Russia. We can defeat Russia. Come on. This is not grown-up behavior. It's very dangerous, and unfortunately, it's been very, very tragic. The war needs to end so that Ukraine can get back to real life.
Professor Sachs, how do you think will regular American people live better if Russia is defeated, if Russia is destroyed?
Russia cannot be destroyed. This is also a basic point. Russia is the world's largest country by land area. It is a very powerful country. It has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons. It has 6,000 nuclear weapons in total. Any language that says Russia will be destroyed is both absurd and completely tragic, because what it invites is nuclear war. And many people, including many Ukrainian officials in recent years, said, oh, don't be scared. That's a bluff. They'll never use nuclear weapons. I have the strongest distaste for people who say that, because I don't want the world blown up. I don't want the world for my granddaughters and grandson blown up. And I think that people who say such things, oh, it's a bluff, don't worry about it, are fools. They're reckless fools. You cannot defeat a nuclear superpower. Not Russia, not the United States, not China, not India. You cannot defeat a nuclear superpower. You live with a nuclear superpower. You make diplomacy. You make security arrangements. You trade. You do other things. But you cannot defeat a nuclear superpower. And to try to do so is a suicide, or it's a homicide for the whole world. So this is why I have opposed American foreign policy for decades, because it's based on an arrogant fantasy that Russia is going to be defeated. It's not going to be defeated, but the attempt could kill us all. And so that's what needs to stop. We need to get back to grown-up behavior, diplomacy, treaties, ending this fighting. And incidentally, such a treaty was on the table in Istanbul on April 15th, 2022, 3 years ago. And it could have been signed. And the United States told the Ukrainian government, don't sign it, don't accept neutrality, we will defeat Russia. Well, all I can say about my government is it was filled with fools. And I knew it then, and I tried to explain why, and it was proved right. This was reckless and foolish poker playing by the United States that had no basis at all in reality.
And based on that, I have my next question. So if you're saying yourself that the foreign policy of the United States is out of touch with reality, we can't trust it, what kind of peace process can we hope for today? You used to say that you're fairly optimistic towards a potential peace treaty for Ukraine, but what kind of peace treaty can be made with a country that has broken the terms of any treaty so many times repeatedly? This is what many Russians are questioning. How would you answer this question?
Look, the basis has to be a mutually satisfactory outcome. And there is one serious problem with it, but one. There are three parts to peace in Ukraine. The first is Ukraine's neutrality. This is a geographic reality, because Ukraine has a more than 2,000-kilometer border with Russia. Russia never would allow NATO, and that means the United States, to have military bases in Ukraine. The whole idea that the United States pushed was a reckless gamble, because the United States government, filled with stupid people, I'm sorry to say, thought that Putin would just not be able to do anything to resist. So the arrogance of the United States was, we can go where we want, we can do what we want, Russia will never resist. And when the Russian government said, no, you cannot have NATO on our border, no, you cannot have American missile systems on our border, the Americans said, oh, Putin, he's just bluffing. He'll never do anything. I know these people in my government. They're stupid. I'm sorry to tell you. Of course, Russia's not going to allow it. Do you think the United States would allow Russian bases in Canada or Russian bases in Mexico? Not for 1 second would they allow that. Well, the same is true with Russia. So the first point of an agreement is neutrality. You know, when Ukraine declared independence in 1991, it was on the basis of neutrality. Then the United States came in and kept trying to get governments that say, oh, we're for NATO. But actually, the public was not for NATO. And when President Yanukovych was elected president in 2009 and took office in 2010, the country was for neutrality because that was the prudent thing to do. But the United States kept pushing and pushing and pushing. So the first point of peace is neutrality. Until this moment, President Zelensky says, we demand NATO. Come on, be real. Understand what this has been about for 30 years. It's not going to happen. So do you want perpetual war or do you want peace? I want peace. So this is number one. Number two is a real security arrangement for all parties. Part of the propaganda of recent years is that Ukraine is at risk. Of course it is, but that Russia has no security interest at all. That's false. Russia has insecurity because of the United States, because the United States pushes its military, because the United States overthrows governments, because the United States has the CIA all over Ukraine and all over Central Asia and all over the Caucasus region, and Russia doesn't like it. So a real agreement is about mutual security, collective security, shared security. It's not only about Ukraine's security, but of course it's also about Ukraine's security. So one needs a realistic agreement that recognizes the mutual security interests of all of the parties. Then there is a third point, which is now the most difficult, but used to be the easiest, and that's the question of territory. Now, I've been through this for 36 years with Russia and Ukraine. Russia made no territorial demands on Ukraine up through 2022, by the way. No, not quite, up through 2014, I would say. Up through the Maidan coup, Russia never made a territorial demand. All it wanted was a long-term lease for Sevastopol. That's all it asked for. It didn't say we want the Donbass. It didn't say we want Crimea. It said we want a long-term lease to 2042 for the naval base at Sevastopol. And that's what Yanukovych and Putin negotiated back in 2010. So there was no other territorial demand. Then came the Maidan. And from the Russian point of view, it's important to understand, as soon as the Maidan coup happened, the Russian side said, NATO is about to take our naval base. And that was not a paranoid idea. That was a very realistic idea. You have to understand the Western approach. We just won. The government's been overthrown. Now NATO will come in. NATO means all of Ukraine. It means also Crimea. So the Russians took Crimea back immediately. Crimea is not going back to Ukraine, period. And that is because of this sad history. Up to February 2014, Crimea was just a long-term lease. But then Russia said it's not going to fall into U.S. hands. And by the way, if one knows history, this is what Britain did. It took Crimea in 1856 in the Treaty of Paris that ended the war. It pushed Russia out of the Black Sea. That was the purpose of Lord Palmerston in the Crimean War. Russia said it's not going to happen. Then, very important to understand what happened with Lugansk and Donetsk. With Lugansk and Donetsk, of course, there was a breakaway by the two provinces, both local and, we don't know, perhaps supported by Russia or not. But that is the ethnically Russian region of Ukraine. And they said, no, we're not accepting the new government after the Maidan coup. Very importantly, Russia did not say that Lugansk and Donetsk need to be part of Russia. All Russia said was that those two oblasts need autonomy politically. That was the Minsk II agreement. And very importantly, the Minsk II agreement was voted by the UN Security Council. And there's another very interesting point about the Minsk II agreement. It was modeled on a region in Italy, which is very interesting. There's a region in northern Italy called South Tyrol, south of the Austrian Tyrolean region. And South Tyrol is a native German-speaking region of Italy. And that region demanded autonomy from the Italian central government. And after some period after World War II, it was granted autonomy. And you know who knew a lot about that autonomy? Angela Merkel, because she had a lot of political relations with the German-speaking population of South Tyrol. Now, I was in South Tyrol last year. It's a very prosperous, peaceful area. It's German speaking, but the Italians are very happy. The German speakers are very happy. It's a very peaceful part of Italy, completely part of Italy. And that was the idea of the Minsk II agreement. Not that Russia would annex Lugansk and Donetsk, but rather that this region would have autonomy because the regime in Kyiv was demanding a crackdown on the use of Russian language or on the Russian Orthodox Church and so forth. And so the call was for autonomy. Ukraine should have been delighted with this, truly. But the United States opposed it, by the way. The United States told the Ukrainian authorities, you don't have to be a federal state. You just assert dominance. You can ignore the Minsk agreements. We know President Poroshenko said, I don't accept the Minsk agreement. They were made with a gun to our head. We're never going to implement them. This was a huge tragedy for Ukraine because Russia was not asking to annex the Donbass. It was only asking for a political arrangement of autonomy for the ethnic Russian-speaking regions. When the Istanbul peace negotiations took place in March and April of 2022, even then, after Russia invaded on February 24th, 2022, even then, Russia was not calling for annexation of the Donbass. So even in the Istanbul process, Ukraine could have kept those regions by saying, we will implement the Minsk II agreement. But the United States told them, don't make compromises. We are going to bring Russia to its knees. We're going to crush Russia with economic sanctions. We're going to defeat Russia with our ATACMS missiles. We're going to defeat Russia with our HIMARS missile systems. In other words, the United States arrogantly told Ukraine, don't compromise. So all of this now has led to 3 bloody years on the battlefield. And in the fall of 2022, Russia annexed Lugansk, Donetsk, and 2 other oblasts as well. Of course, everybody knows Kherson and Zaporizhia. Now, it's a much tougher situation for Ukraine than it was 3 years ago. Again, I could have told my Ukrainian friends, don't listen to the United States. They have this wrong. And so there's going to have to be a territorial concession now, not one that was needed.
No, Professor Sachs, everything you say, have you communicated that to anyone from Trump's president administration? I'm wondering whether President Trump is being sincere in his desire to end this war.
Yes, Trump definitely wants to end this war because it's a waste of money and a waste of time for the United States, and it's not going to work. So what Trump understands in very straightforward terms, and he says it, he says, this is Biden's war. This isn't my war. I don't want this war. So Trump wants the war to end because he knows it's a loser for the United States. But by the way, it means it's also a loser for Ukraine in the same way. Ukraine is not going to win on the battlefield a restoration of the 1991 borders. To think so is, again, just another fantasy which could get millions of Ukrainians killed. It makes no sense at all. So Trump wants the war to end because it's a loser for him. because he knows that there's no upside to this war. It was a gamble, a reckless gamble by Biden. By the way, I believe the Biden administration was incredibly incompetent, and I said so for years. They just were making terrible decisions. But the Ukrainian side, I'm so sorry to say, was listening to them and believing them. And when I tried to warn them about this, they said, no, no, that's Putin's propaganda. It wasn't. It was just a realistic assessment of the situation. Now, what else does Trump want? Of course, he's a greedy guy. He wants to grab as many resources of Ukraine as he can. That's no bargain for Ukraine. You know, wants to take advantage of Ukraine on the way out. I find that horrendous. I'm completely against that approach. So I want the war to end, but I don't want the United States even to dream of taking Ukraine's resources. My God, Ukraine has to rebuild now. It needs those resources. It's going to need that income. The United States is not a friend of Ukraine for rebuilding. The United States is a threat to Ukraine for rebuilding. So the war should end. Ukraine should keep its resources, but Ukraine, first and foremost, should engage in negotiations right now and should say, well, I don't know, it's so hard for these politicians to admit anything. But the truth of the matter is straightforward, which is that the agreement that was on the table in Istanbul on April 15th, 2022, which I have read with care many times because it's available online, was a perfectly fine agreement for Ukraine. It should have been signed then. Something like it should be signed now. And Ukraine should also ask the UN Security Council. Yes, it includes Russia. Yes, it includes the United States. It also includes China. It also includes Britain and France. Ukraine should look to the UN Security Council as the way to achieve a security agreement. That's very important, not some bilateral promise from Keith Starmer, for God's sake, or from Macron. This makes no sense. But a UN agreement that is properly designed and that protects Ukraine's sovereignty, albeit with some territorial loss, which is the result of these years of war.
But Professor Sachs, wouldn't that be easier for President Trump, as of now, to quit the negotiation process, and he has threatened to do so already, and just leave Ukraine and Russia and Europe alone? And then these three could be in a clash. But Trump could do both in doing so. They could weaken Russia and Europe. Don't you think that could happen?
Oh, absolutely. That is very plausible. So I don't think Trump is bluffing when he says, look, if the two sides don't agree, we're walking away from it. I think that's absolutely possible. And I think it would be terrible for Ukraine, by the way, because Ukraine will lose hundreds of thousands, if not millions of young people if it continues fighting. Ukraine is bleeding. It's terrible. It's tragic. And the war should stop for that reason by itself, because the costs are too high and they're completely unnecessary. And Ukraine is not going to defeat Russia. It's not. Maybe both sides bloody each other, but it's a tragedy. The war should stop. The young people should have their lives. They should raise their families. They shouldn't go to the front lines to be killed.
Professor Sachs, I wanted to ask you, you have met President Zelensky and you know his current position. And frankly speaking, I am strongly doubting whether the Zelensky would be ready to start peace negotiations if this war is over. I don't think Zelensky would preserve his office. As of now, I'm quite certain that the war in Ukraine is the largest corruption scheme in history, because the scale of corruption is really horrendous. And among others, of course, those are the taxpayers' money in the United States that are being embezzled. I've done my estimate of the latest corruption scandals in Ukraine, and my estimate is $65 billion being embezzled. The corruption is horrendous. So many Ukrainian people are being banned from leaving the country, and they're paying bribes to escape the front line. What do you think about the role of Zelensky in this war? What is your personal impression of Zelensky? I know that you've met him in 2019.
A president of Ukraine should make peace, period. And as long as Zelensky says, we continue to fight, we'll never give in, we demand all his list of demands, 1991 border, we will mobilize. I can't support that at all. That's just a death sentence for people in Ukraine. And so a president of Ukraine representing the real interests of the people would know it's time for this war to end. In fact, sad to say, the war should have ended 3 years ago. Again, I'm so sorry to Ukraine for what the United States did to Ukraine. The United States is an arrogant and very often stupid country, and it created a huge mess for Ukraine. And I warned and warned and warned that that would happen. But a president of Ukraine should stop this war and stop the Russia hatred and the Russophobia and all the rhetoric and all the talk about defeat and we will fight and we will fight and we will fight. A president of Ukraine should protect the people of Ukraine. That means not sending them to the front line to die in huge numbers. That means establishing a basis for peace.
Thinking of the reasons for Putin and Russia to stop here, I wanted to ask you the following question. I'm sure you know the city of Odessa in the south of Ukraine, which is an important seaport. In terms of culture and economy, who do you think Odessa belongs to? And do you think Putin would leave Odessa to Ukraine?
Well, Odessa belongs to Ukraine, but whether Putin would leave Odessa to Ukraine if the war continues, my guess is no. If the war continues, Russia will take more territory, and Odessa could very well be one of the targets. It's one of the magnificent places in the world. It's a center of culture and of history, and it is undoubtedly part of Ukraine right now. But undoubtedly, if the war continues and Russia takes more and more territory, it's undoubtedly of interest to some Russians to take it in a military conquest. This is another reason for the war to stop. Stop now, end the conflict, don't lose more territory, don't lose more lives, don't have more suffering, don't have continued risk of nuclear war. Stop the war and have security arranged on the realistic terms now, and do it at the United Nations.
You have worked with Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin, and in your book, you wrote about the mistakes that were made back in the 90s by the Russian leadership. You were writing that we do not know yet whether Russia will be able to become a proper country with working democratic mechanism and market economy, but we do know that many opportunities were wasted. What would you say? Has Russia become an adequate, proper country? Do you think President Putin is a patriot of Russia?
Well, my main argument was that the West, meaning the United States and Europe, should help Gorbachev and then help Yeltsin and Kuchma to make reforms and to stabilize the economy in the early 1990s. This was my whole approach, that Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Kuchma all offered peace. They all offered a new world beyond the Cold War. And that since the United States and Europe had spent so much money on the military and the Cold War, let's spend some money on peace and help make the transformation in Russia and Ukraine. That was my argument. It was called the Grand Bargain in 1990. I worked with Grigory Yavlinsky on that to present it to the US government in 1991. And it was completely rejected by the United States government. And then when President Yeltsin came to office at the end of 1991 as president of an independent Russia, I presented it again. I said, well, it's not the Soviet Union. Now help Russia. And it was rejected again by the United States. Why? Well, recently I've read the minutes of the meeting at the White House on June 3rd, 1991, in which my proposal was rejected. And I can't even express how stupid these people were in the White House. They said, oh, reform can never work. Oh, we don't owe them anything. Oh, we should do the least possible. Oh, we need a good PR package. These were nasty, cynical, arrogant Americans. One of them was my former colleague at Harvard University, actually. He was an opponent of any kind of real help for the Soviet Union. And when you read this, it's shocking to me how unserious American policy was. So there's no doubt, after the decades of central planning, after so many errors and tragedies in the Soviet system, that the Soviet system and its successor countries needed help. But the Western world wasn't interested. When I helped Poland and said, Poland needs help, they poured in the money. This was very interesting. Poland got lots of help on time because they already said, oh, Poland's on our side, Russia is on the other side. And so the Americans were quite cynical right from the beginning. You asked me, is President Putin a patriot? Undoubtedly, he's a patriot. That I have no doubt about. He's a Russian patriot. I'm sure that Ukrainian leaders are Ukrainian patriots. The point, though, is to make something constructive out of this, something useful out of this, not killing so many innocent people, but actually something constructive. Peace, neutrality, economic activity, trade, not all of the hatred. It's actually possible. And that is what is really needed.
I know that you've met many Ukrainian politicians. Which of them would you call the most decent and honest?
I can't judge the honesty. I really can't because I was never inside the system enough. I've enjoyed my interactions, but I have been incredibly frustrated, of course, with what I've seen, because Ukraine deserves better than it's gotten in the last 34 years since declaring independence. It's deserved a lot better. Tragically, the United States messed up badly and will be judged to have messed up badly in history. But Ukraine now needs to understand its situation, and Ukrainian leaders, whoever they are, I don't pick other countries' governments. I don't even express preferences for other countries' governments. But what I do say is that whoever is in government should respect the real interests of the people. The real interest of Ukraine is peace. The real way to peace is not war, it is diplomacy. The real solution is to sit down, whether it's in Istanbul or in Riyadh or in Kyiv or in Moscow or in New York at the UN Security Council, but it's to negotiate an end to this war now.
Professor Sachs, I wanted to request you to address regular Ukrainian people who are watching this interview. I know what they feel. They are upset, they are disillusioned, they are scared. Many Ukrainian men are afraid to go outside to the streets. They had to quit their jobs because they are afraid that they will be forcefully sent to the front line. But nonetheless, after everything that has happened to Ukraine, today Ukrainian people tend to be very negative towards Russia. Today, the idea of forgiving Russia is not at all popular. What would you tell to a regular Ukrainian person who is watching this interview, who probably believes that we talk about is too abstract? What do you think every person can do in their lives so that our lives get better?
I'm not asking for Ukraine to forgive Russia or Russia to forgive Ukraine or even that concept. I'm asking for peace right now, to end the war, to end the killing, and to start the rebuilding, and to understand enough of the history to understand why this war happened and how it can be ended. And rather than pointing the finger at Putin as the sole instigator of this, I'm telling the average people, no, know the history of this. I've been 36 years watching this history. The United States bears a tremendous amount of responsibility for this dreadful tragedy that has ensued. And by understanding that, by understanding how the U.S. recklessly pushed Ukraine to take sides, recklessly pushed Ukraine against neutrality, recklessly supported a violent coup in February 2014, recklessly talked Ukraine out of the Minsk agreement, recklessly, by the way, walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, which the United States did in 2002, recklessly walked out of the intermediate nuclear force agreement in 2019. The United States created an amount of tension in your country that exploded. And it did it ignorantly, and it did it in a way maliciously. Not maliciously against Ukraine, but maliciously against Russia. And the whole thing backfired. And so what I'm saying for every person right now is peace is real and possible. Ukraine has lots of friends that want peace and want Ukrainians to stop dying. And peace can be achieved. And it's not an illusion, because there was almost a peace agreement 3 years ago. I'm standing ready, and I know all over the world, friends of Ukraine are standing ready to ensure that there's an achievable, real peace. Not something that in 6 months Ukraine's invaded again. No, I mean a real peace, but not a mythical peace where Ukraine gets everything that it wants because it says so, or because the United States once told them so. No, it has to be realistic so that it takes into account how all of this came about, what has happened on the battlefield, and how this war can end right now. And I want Ukrainian leaders to invite their Russian counterparts to Kyiv, and for them to go to Moscow, or to meet, as I said, in Istanbul, or in Riyadh, or in Rome, where I happen to be a city of peace, to actually sit down and work out a way to live together. I'm not talking about some fantastic dream of forgiveness right now. I'm talking about practicality so that your sons and your daughters, or you as young people, are not being dragged off the streets and sent to the front lines. This is too painful and horrendous to continue this way.
Professor Sachs, and the final question on my side. Just a few years ago, I've been saying that Ukraine needs war, needs peace treaty. I was sanctioned for that. There are 2 criminal cases opened against me in Ukraine for simply a post on a social media where I wrote that in order to rescue Ukraine, we need peace. And today, all I'm trying to convey via my social media accounts that Ukraine needs the audit of financial assistance by the United States, because until there is corrupt establishment in Ukraine, they will never end the war. Why do you think President Trump is not rushing to conduct audit of financial assistance to Ukraine?
If you ask me to speak about what President Trump does or doesn't do, it's impossible. I have no idea what is actually on his mind. Uh, Again, I explained, he probably wants to grab even more resources from Ukraine, as I said in this minerals agreement. So I don't really trust the United States at all. I never have trusted the United States in any of this. Again, what I would say, I hope I'm not naive, but what I would say is that the overwhelming thing that Ukraine needs right now actually is not an audit, is not even blame, is not forgiveness. What Ukraine needs is an end of the war. Ukraine could have and would have and will have a wonderful future in peace. And by the way, the future is absolutely going to look in all directions, east and west, north and south. That's how the real world is. Look at your neighbors and figure out how to get along with them. That's the trick of life. If you are at war with your neighbors, you can never have peace in your home. And this, I think, is the basic truth. So this is what I'm really hoping for most of all, is that people will say, okay, whatever it is, we need the killing to stop. Maybe nobody's going to get all that they want. Maybe justice is not going to be complete, but nothing is worse, actually, than this ongoing bloodshed.
Professor Sachs, thank you so much. It is my mission to make sure that people in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus start living in peace as soon as possible. Thank you so much for advocating peace. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you very much. Dear friends, that was Professor Jeremy Sachs with us today. I wish us all peace and goodbye.